The wind howled like a choir of grieving ghosts, clawing at the lonely cabin perched on the edge of the world. Inside, Abigail stoked a dying fire, the silence of the snow-choked wilderness, her only companion for a year. But tonight, silence bled away. It was a sound almost lost in the gale that pricked her ear, a scraping at the door. Not the scratch of a branch, but the drag of a body. She froze her hand, hovering over the warmth of the hearth. Out there in the white fury of a New Mexico blizzard, something was dying, and it was asking her for help. The world had been whittled down to this 4 log walls and the screaming blizzard. For Abigail, the storm was less an enemy and more a mirror. It raged, and in the quiet, frozen chambers of her heart, so did she. It had been a year to the day since the fever took her, Thomas, leaving her the sole inhabitant of their hard-won claim on the western slope of the Chuska Mountains. Their dream of a ranch, of a life wrested from the unforgiving land, had turned to her solitary confinement. The cabin was small but sturdy, a testament to Thomas's skill. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hungry mouth consuming the precious wood she'd spent the autumn chopping. A bed with a patchwork quilt, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, one now perpetually empty, and shelves holding tins of beans, sacks of flour, and her dwindling supply of coffee. Outside, the temperature had plummeted, and the snow, which had begun as a gentle dusting 2 days ago, was now a relentless driving force, piling in great drifts that buried the fences and threatened to swallow the cabin whole. It was in this maelstrom, this symphony of wind and ice, that she heard it. At first she dismissed it. The old logs groaned and settled. The wind played tricks mimicking voices, cries, the whispers of the dead. She'd learned to ignore the ghosts of sound. But this was different. It was a rhythmic, desperate scrape, scrape, thump. The sound of something heavy, something with the last dregs of intention, dragging itself across her porch. Her breath caught. A bear driven mad by hunger. A wolf. Her gaze darted to the Winchester rifle resting on its pegs above the door, its brass receiver gleaming in the firelight. Thomas had taught her to shoot. Out here, Abby, he'd said, his voice warm as summer. A rifle isn't for sport. It's for living. Scrape. Thump. Silence. The silence was worse. It stretched taut and terrifying. Had the creature succumbed, or was it listening? Waiting. Abigail rose slowly, her joints stiff from the cold and from a tension that had coiled deep in her belly. She crept to the cabin's single window, its glass frosted over with a delicate icy filigree. With a gloved finger, she rubbed a small circle clear. What she saw stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't a beast. It was a man. Or what was left of one. He was collapsed against her door, a dark shape in the swirling white. The snow was already beginning to claim him, dusting his broad shoulders and the cascade of black hair that spilled from his head. He was Indian, Navajo by the look of his clothing, though it was hard to tell through the blood. So much blood. A dark, ugly stain blossoming from his side, melting the snow in a sickening halo. Abigail recoiled from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct, every lesson learned in this hard land screamed at her. Danger. Savage. Leave him. The stories were legion, whispered in the dusty streets of Fort Defiance, and spat from the mouths of grizzled trappers. Stories of raids of violence, of a people who were as wooled and untamable as the mountains they called home. Her own uncle had been killed in a skirmish with a Ute war party 20 years ago. The fear was a deep-seated thing, a seed planted in childhood and watered by a lifetime on the frontier. She should leave him. Let the storm take him. It was the law of the wild. The hawk does not mourn the rabbit. She paced the length of the small cabin, her boots thudding a frantic rhythm on the wooden floorboards. One life. One soul out there in the cold. Was his life worth less than hers because of the color of his skin? The language he spoke, Thomas wouldn't have thought so. Thomas, who had traded fairly with the Navajo, who had learned a few of their words, who believed peace was a sturdier shelter than any stockade. But Thomas was gone, and she was alone. If she brought him in, what then, if he lived? He might kill her for her supplies. He might be a scout for a war party that would return to finish the job. If he died, she would be left with a body to bury in the frozen ground. And if someone found out she'd helped him, a hostile, as the army called them, she would be branded a traitor, an outcast. The marshal from the settlement, a hard-eyed man named Miller, who had been making unwelcome visits since Thomas's death, would surely see it as proof of her unfitness to live so far from protection. She stopped her pacing, her gaze falling on the empty chair at the table. Loneliness was a cold companion, but was it colder than the wind biting at that man's flesh? For a year, she had been a ghost in her own home, tending the embers of a life that had been extinguished. She cooked for one, slept on one side of the bed, spoke only to the chickens. The silence was driving her mad. Perhaps madness was what was needed to survive out here. Damn it all to hell, she whispered the words, a plume of condensation in the frigid air. The decision once made settled in her with a grim certainty. She could not let a man die on her doorstep, no matter who he was. It wasn't about him. It was about her. About the woman she wanted to be, the woman Thomas had loved. She pulled on her heavy sheepskin coat, wrapped a woolen scarf around her face, and took a deep breath. Her hand hesitated for a moment over the Winchester, then fell away. If this was to be an act of mercy, it could not begin with a weapon. She unbarred the heavy door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, a solid wall of ice and fury. It tore the door from her grasp, slamming it back against the interior wall. Snow swirled into the cabin, instantly melting on the warm floor. The man was right there, practically at her feet. He was larger than she'd thought, powerfully built, even in his wounded state. His face turned to the side, and half buried in the snow was grim, sculpted with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. His skin was the color of rich earth. He wore buckskin leggings and a tunic now shredded and soaked with blood along his left side. A magnificent turquoise necklace, a string of polished stones and silver was stark against his chest. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Gritting her teeth against the gale, Abigail knelt. "Hey," she said, her voice immediately snatched away by the wind. She put her hands on his shoulders. He was freezing his body, radiating a deathly chill. "You have to help me," she grunted, trying to pull him. He was dead weight, a mountain of a man. For a frantic minute, she struggled, her muscles screaming in protest. The snow bit at her exposed skin, and the wind threatened to rip the very breath from her lungs. She couldn't do it. He was too heavy. Despair washed over her. She had made her choice, and she was going to fail. Then a flicker of movement. An eyelid fluttered. His eyes opened just a slit. They were dark, fathomless, and for a heartbeat, they were lucid. They stared at her, not with fear or hate, but with a dazed, burning intensity. Then a low groan rumbled in his chest, and he tried to move to push himself up with one arm. The effort gave her the leverage she needed. "That's it," she urged, half shouting over the storm. "Work with me." With a final desperate heave, she dragged him over the threshold. The movement jostled his wound, and a pained hiss escaped his lips before he fell limp again. Abigail slammed the door against the storm and dropped the bar, her body trembling with exertion and adrenaline. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the ragged sound of the stranger's breathing. He lay on her floor, a piece of the wild storm brought inside, bleeding on the planks that Thomas had so carefully laid. Snow melted from his hair, pooling around his head like a dark halo. Abigail stood over him, her chest heaving the full weight of her decision, crashing down upon her. She had just invited the wilderness into her home, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the blizzard itself that nothing would ever be the same. The fire in the hearth crackled a lone beacon against the fury without and the uncertainty within. She had given a dying man shelter from the snow. Now she had to save him from the fire of his own wound and the water of his own blood. The first battle was against the cold. The man's buckskins were soaked through, clinging to him like a second frozen skin. Leaving him in them would be a death sentence, the chill seeping into his bones until his heart gave up its tired rhythm. Abigail knew she had to get them off him, a task that filled her with a mixture of clinical resolve and a profound sense of trespass. She stoked the fire until it roared its hungry flames, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin grew warmer, the air thick with the smell of wet wool pine smoke and the coppery tang of blood. She fetched her sharpest skinning knife. Kneeling beside him, she hesitated for only a second before carefully cutting the laces of his tunic. The leather was stiff and cold, but the blade was sharp. She worked with a practiced efficiency, honed by years of skinning game, yet her hands trembled slightly. This was no deer or rabbit. This was a man, a stranger from a world that was supposed to be her enemy. As she peeled the ruined tunic away, the extent of his injury was laid bare in the flickering firelight. It was worse than she had feared. A ragged gash, black and swollen at the edges, tore across his left side just above his hip. It looked like a bullet wound, but not a clean one. It was gouged and brutal, as if the lead had torn through him with a vicious, twisting anger. The flesh around it was hot to the touch, a sign that infection was already setting in. His body was a canvas of old scars, faint white lines that spoke of a life of conflict and survival. But beneath the scars and the blood, his form was powerful, his muscles coiled like dormant springs. He was a warrior, that much was clear. His right hand was clenched, even in unconsciousness, around a small, tightly wrapped leather bundle tied to his belt. It seemed to be the one thing on his person that was perfectly fortune, as if he had protected it with his own body as he fell. Ignoring the intimacy of the act, she cut away his leggings, her movements brisk and impersonal. She had to keep him alive. That was the only thought she allowed to take root. She dragged him closer to the fire, turning him gently onto his uninjured side, and covered him with her thickest wool blankets. The second battle was against the wound itself. She boiled water in her largest kettle, the steam clouding the small window. Into the water, she dropped a handful of willow bark, a remedy her mother had sworn by, for fevers and pain, and a pinch of the precious salt she usually reserved for curing meat. While the water boiled, she rifled through a small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. It contained her meager medical supplies, clean linen for bandages, a needle and thread, and a small dark bottle of carbolic acid that a traveling doctor had sold her, claiming it could kill the poisons in a wound. She prayed he was right. The man groaned, his head tossing back and forth on the folded blanket she'd placed beneath it. His fever was rising. His skin, once deathly cold, now burned with an inner fire. He muttered in a language she did not understand the words, guttural and sharp fragments of a fevered dream. Easy now, she found herself whispering, her voice soft. "You're safe." The lie tasted strange on her tongue. He was not safe. And with him here, neither was she. She cleansed the wound first using strips of linen, soaked in the hot, salted water. He flinched and cried out as she worked, a raw animal sound of pure agony that clawed at her own nerves. She bit her lip and continued her touch, as gentle as she could manage, wiping away the blood and grime, exposing the raw, torn flesh beneath. Her stomach churned, but she forced the bile down. She had butchered hogs and dressed deer. This was just flesh and blood. But it wasn't. The sounds he made were too human, the life ebbing from him too precious. The bullet was still in there. She could feel it with the tip of her finger, a hard lump lodged against a rib. Leaving it in would mean certain death from infection. Taking it out, God taking it out, might kill him from the shock and the pain. Her hands shook. Thomas had always been the strong one, the steady one. What would he do? He would do what needed to be done. He would not flinch from the hard choice. Taking a deep breath, she poured a small amount of the carbolic acid into the wound. The man arched his back with a silent scream, his body going rigid. His eyes flew open wide and wild with delirium and pain. They fixed on her, but she wasn't sure he was seeing her. He was seeing the face of his own personal devil. Then his eyes rolled back, and he mercifully passed out again. Her knife, sterilized in the flames of the fire until the tip glowed red, was the only tool she had. With the man unconscious, she knew it was now or never. She offered a silent, desperate prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Probing the wound with the tip of the blade was a horrific, intimate violation. She could feel it scrape against his bone. For a sickening moment, she thought she would be sick. But she held on, guided by touch and a prayer. Then she felt it, the soft lead of the bullet. With a final grim movement, she leveraged it out. It fell onto the floorboards with a dull clink, misshapen and wicked-looking. It was a slug from a Colt peacemaker, standard issue for the cavalry, but also a favorite of lawmen and outlaws alike. The worst was over, or so she hoped. She cleaned the wound again, her hands now steady, and then took up her needle and thread. She had only ever stitched canvas and buckskin, but the principle was the same. She worked quickly, her stitches small and tight, pulling the ragged edges of flesh together. When she was done, she applied a poultice of crushed willow bark and covered the entire area with the last of her clean linen. Exhausted, she slumped back on her heels, her body aching. The cabin was an inferno, the fire roaring. The man lay still, his breathing evening out, becoming deeper, more regular. The fire of the fever was still upon him, but the fire of the infection, she prayed, had been fought back. She had given him fire. Now he needed water. His lips were cracked and dry. Using a spoon, she gently trickled water mixed with a little whiskey between them. He swallowed reflexively. She continued this for what felt like hours, a patient, rhythmic ritual. Spoonful by spoonful, she gave him water, coaxing his body back toward life. She lost track of time. The storm continued its assault on the world outside. But inside the cabin, time was measured only by the man's breaths and the crackle of the fire. She dozed in the chair, waking with a start every hour to check on him, to give him more water, to feel his forehead. The fever raged for 2 days. He was lost in his own world, a landscape of pain and memory. He cried out for someone named Ashki, and once with a terrifying clarity he shouted a single, sharp word in English lyre. During his delirium, his hand never strayed far from the leather bundle at his hip. In a moment of lucidity, his eyes opened and found hers. They were clear for just a second. He glanced down at the bundle, then back at her, a silent, desperate plea in his gaze. She understood. She reached out and gently touched the bundle, then her own chest, and nodded. "I will protect it." A flicker of relief crossed his face before the fever pulled him back under. On the third morning, the storm broke. Sunlight, thin and pale, pierced the gloom, reflecting off the vast, unspoiled expanse of new-fallen snow. The world was silent, muffled, and breathtakingly beautiful. And inside the cabin, the man's fever had broken. She woke to find him watching her. He was awake, truly awake, this time. His dark eyes were clear and intelligent, holding no trace of the delirium's madness. They were cautious, wary, but also held a flicker of something else, gratitude. He tried to sit up, and she was at his side in an instant. "Easy," she said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You've been through a lot." He winced, but settled back down. He looked at the clean bandage on his side, then around the small cabin, his gaze taking in every detail. Finally, his eyes rested on her. "Diliehe," he said. His voice was raspy, weak, but clear. Abigail shook her head. "I don't understand." He pointed a finger at the dying embers in the fireplace. "Ko," he said. Then he pointed to the cup of water on the floor beside him. "To." Fire. Water. Then he looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering, and spoke a word that was soft, almost a whisper. "Atsa." Eagle. He then touched his own chest. "Haska." She understood. He was naming what she had given him. Fire and water. And he was naming himself. Haska. Warrior. Then he had named her Eagle. Perhaps for the way she had watched over him, or perhaps for the fierce determination she didn't know she possessed. "Abigail," she said, pointing to her own chest. He nodded slowly, testing the name on his tongue. Abigail. A fragile truce settled between them in the quiet cabin. The storm outside had passed, but they were now in the eye of a much more personal one. He was Navajo, a warrior. She was a white woman, a settler. Between them lay a chasm of blood, history, and mistrust. Yet in this small, isolated space, she had given him fire and water. And in doing so, she had kindled something new and dangerous in the ashes of her own life. A connection, a secret that if discovered would surely consume them both. The days that followed the blizzard were a strange, silent ballet. Language was a barrier as vast and white as the snow-covered landscape outside, but necessity became their translator. Haska, weak but resolute, communicated with gestures and single, carefully chosen words. A nod toward the water bucket, a questioning look at the dwindling woodpile. Abigail in turn learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the tightening of his jaw that meant pain, the flicker in his eyes that spoke of a thought he could not voice. She learned he had a quiet strength that had nothing to do with his physical prowess. He was patient, observant. He watched her as she went about her chores, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the way she always set 2 plates on the table before catching herself and putting one away. He saw the faint, worn patch on the floor by the empty chair where Thomas used to sit. He said nothing, but his silence was not empty. It was respectful understanding. One afternoon, as she was redressing his wound, he spoke. The gash was healing the angry red, softening to a clean pink line, a testament to her care. "The metal," he said, the English word clumsy in his mouth. "You took it." Abigail started, surprised. "You speak English." A wry, fleeting smile touched his lips. "A little. From trader at Fort Defiance. Not good." "It's good enough," she said, her relief palpable. "Yes, I took it out. The bullet." She retrieved the misshapen lump of lead from the mantelpiece and showed it to him. His eyes narrowed as he looked at it, a dark fire kindling in their depths. "Miller!" He grunted the name, a curse. "Miller!" The name shot a bolt of ice through Abigail's veins. "Marshall Miller." Hasker nodded, his jaw tight. He and 2 others. They waited. Not a fight. An ambush. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. Marshall Miller, the man who brought her supplies from the settlement, the man who always stayed a little too long, his eyes lingering on her with a possessive gleam. The man who portrayed himself as her protector. He had done this. "Why?" Abigail asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hasker's gaze shifted to the leather bundle, which he now kept beside him at all times. "They wanted this. They tracked me for 2 days. Thought I had silver." He looked back at her. "Not silver. Medicine." He gestured for her to hand him the bundle. His fingers, long and surprisingly deft, worked at the intricate knots. He unwrapped the oilskin outer layer to reveal an inner wrapping of soft, worn deerskin. Inside were several smaller pouches, a collection of smooth stones, dried herbs, and a single breathtakingly beautiful eagle feather, its white tip dipped in what looked like red ochre. "My people," he began, struggling to find the words. "The winter is hard. The children, they are sick. This is a jish, a medicine bundle, for the Hojhwoji, the blessing way ceremony. It brings back balance, health." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate earnestness. "Without this, the healer's songs are empty. More children will go to the stars." Abigail stared at the sacred objects, a profound weight settling upon her. She hadn't just saved a man. She had saved a vessel of hope for an entire community. The thought was both terrifying and humbling. She had, by blind chance, stumbled into the middle of a conflict far older and deeper than a simple ambush. It was a war of survival, of culture, of faith. And Marshall Miller was on the other side. Her alliance with Hasker, born of a blizzard and a moment of compassion, was now sealed in conspiracy. She was no longer just a helper. She was an accomplice. The knowledge was a cold knot in her stomach. 4 days later, as the sun began its descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the sound of hoofbeats broke the immense silence. It was not the soft tread of an unshod Indian pony, but the heavy, confident clip-clop of an American horse. "Someone's coming," Abigail said, her heart leaping into her throat. Hasker was already moving. Despite the pain in his side, he swung his legs off the bed, his face a mask of grim determination. "Miller." There was nowhere to hide. The cabin was a single room. Panic flared in Abigail's chest, hot and suffocating. Miller would see him. He would kill Hasker, and God only knew what he would do to her. "The root cellar," she said suddenly. A small trap-door, usually hidden beneath a bearskin rug, led to a cramped, dark space dug into the earth beneath the cabin. It was small, cold, and smelled of damp soil and potatoes. Hasker gave a single sharp nod. He gathered his medicine bundle and the blankets, his movements, swift and silent as a shadow. Abigail pulled the heavy rug aside, lifted the trapdoor, and he descended without a sound. As she lowered the door, his dark eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. It was a look of complete trust, a trust that terrified her more than Miller's arrival. She dragged the rug back into place just as a sharp knock echoed from the door. She smoothed her apron, took a steadying breath, and opened it. Marshal Wade Miller stood on her porch, a silhouette against the setting sun. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder with a florid face and pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He held a string of rabbits in one hand and a proprietary smile on his face. "Afternoon, Abigail," he said, his voice a little too familiar. "Saw the smoke from your chimney, clear from the ridge. Figured since the storm had passed, I'd check on our favorite widow. Make sure you didn't get buried in there." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. "Brought you some supper." "That's very kind of you, Marshal," Abigail said, forcing a smile. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. Hasker was directly beneath their feet. Could Miller hear him breathe? "Just Miller is fine, Abigail. We're neighbors after all," he said, dropping the rabbits on her table. His eyes swept the cabin, and a slight frown creased his brow. "Been busy, have you? Looks different in here." "Just cleaning. The storm made a mess." "Smells different too," he said, sniffing the air. "Like, I don't know, ointment." His gaze sharpened, landing on the small bottle of carbolic acid she'd foolishly left on a shelf. "You ailin'?" "Just a cut," she lied, instinctively hiding her own hand behind her back. "A slip of the knife while chopping wood before the storm." Miller's eyes lingered on her for a moment too long before he seemed to accept the explanation. He walked over to the fire, warming his hands. "Well, you ought to be more careful. A woman alone out here. It's not right." He turned to face her, his expression shifting from feigned concern to something harder. "Speaking of which, we had some trouble a few days back, right before the blizzard hit." Abigail held her breath. "Tracked a Navajo horse thief up into these hills." Miller continued, his voice casual. "Ambushed me and my deputies. We wounded him, but he got away in the storm. Cunning devil." He watched her face closely. "You ain't seen anyone lurking about, have you? A lone brave maybe looking for shelter?" The lie felt like swallowing sand. "No, Marshal. I've seen no one. The storm was too thick to see the porch, let alone the hills." "Good. Good." He nodded, but his eyes were still searching, probing. "He was after more than horses, we reckon. He was carrying something. Looked valuable." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "There's a bounty on him. $50. A man like that is dangerous. He'd slit your throat for a can of beans." $50. To Miller. Hasker's life, his sacred mission, was worth 50 pieces of silver. The hypocrisy of it, the sheer brutal arrogance, ignited a spark of cold fury in Abigail. She thought of Hasker in the dark below, wounded by this very man, his only crime trying to save the children of his tribe. "I'll be sure to keep my door barred, Marshal," she said, her voice steady, despite the rage churning within her. Miller smiled, satisfied. He thought he was talking to a fragile, helpless widow. He had no idea he was standing over the very man he was hunting, being lied to by a woman who had chosen her side. "You do that," he said, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his Colt Peacemaker, the same model that had fired the bullet she'd dug from Hasker's flesh. "I'll be back in a few days. The snow's still too deep in the high passes for him to have gotten through. He's trapped up here. Somewhere." He walked to the door, then paused. "And he's wounded. Badly. He'll be desperate." He gave her one last, lingering look, and was gone. Abigail barred the door and leaned against it, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She waited until the sound of his horse faded completely, before she threw the rug aside and opened the cellar door. Hasker emerged, his face grim. He had heard everything. "He will come back," Hasker said. It was not a question. "Yes," Abigail replied, her voice trembling. "He thinks you're trapped." "The passes," Hasker said, looking towards the window, towards the towering, snow-covered peaks of the Chuska Mountains. "Lukachukai Pass, my brothers, they will be waiting there, watching for me." A desperate plan began to form in Abigail's mind, a plan so reckless and dangerous it stole her breath. "He said the snow is too deep," she thought aloud. "But he'll be on a heavy American horse. Your people ride ponies bred for these mountains." Hasker saw the direction of her thoughts. "It is too far for me to walk. My wound." "You won't walk," Abigail said, a fierce determination hardening her voice. She looked at him, the wounded warrior, and at the sacred bundle he protected. She looked at the empty chair that had defined her life for a year. That life was over. Miller's visit, his lies, his casual brutality, had burned it to the ground. "You'll ride." She had one horse left, an old steady mare named Bessie. She wasn't a mountain pony, but she was sure-footed. "He'll come back," she said more to herself than to Hasker. "Which means we have to leave before he does. We leave at dawn." Hasker stared at her, a complex mixture of astonishment and deep, profound respect in his eyes. He had come to her door, seeking refuge from the storm. She had offered him fire and water, mended his flesh, and stood between him and his enemy. Now she was offering him the one thing he could not have found on his own, a way home. She was offering him the dawn. The hours before dawn were a crucible of whispered plans and silent, frantic motion. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a well-lit trap, its warmth a beacon for the evil that would surely come with the morning sun. Every shadow thrown by the guttering lamp seemed to hold the sneering face of Marshal Miller. The decision to flee had been made in a flash of desperate clarity, but its execution was a deliberate, chilling process of severing the final ties to Abigail's life. She moved with a spectral grace, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own past. She packed not with the hopeful energy of a traveler, but with the grim finality of a soldier abandoning a doomed fortress. Into a worn burlap sack went the practical necessities, a slab of dried beef hard as iron, a small cloth bag of oats for Bessie, her last loyal companion, a handful of salt. She paused her hand, hovering over her dwindling supply of Arbuckle's coffee. It was an absurd luxury, a foolish weight to carry into the wilderness. Yet she took the half-empty tin. It was a tether to civilization, a memory of quiet mornings with Thomas the rich aroma, a small rebellion against the raw, scentless cold that awaited them. Her eyes fell upon the Winchester rifle resting on its pegs. Thomas had oiled it every Sunday, his hands moving with a craftsman's love. For a year, it had been an artifact, a painful reminder of his absence. Now it felt like his last bequest, a transfer of responsibility. Her hands were steady as she took it down its weight, familiar and terrible. She strapped it to Bessie's saddle, along with a precious box of 4440 cartridges. It was no longer an object for hunting game. It was a counterpoint to the lawman's Colt, a potential answer to the violence that hunted them. Across the small room, Hasker prepared himself. The agony in his side was a visible thing, a shadow that flickered across his face with every movement. He refused her offers of help, his pride a shield against the indignity of his weakness. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, each motion measured to conserve strength and minimize the pull on her stitches. He sat on the edge of the bed, the sacred jish resting on his lap. He rewrapped the deerskin bundle, his long fingers working the leather ties into intricate, secure knots. It was not the hurried action of a man packing a bag. It was a ritual, a prayer rendered in hide and string. He was centering himself, drawing strength from the object he was tasked to protect. When he was done, he secured it not to the saddle, but to his own belt, a physical extension of his being. He would die before he was parted from it. He looked up, and his eyes met hers, across the flickering lamplight. No words were exchanged, none were needed. In that shared gaze, a profound and binding pact was sealed. He was entrusting her with his life, his quest, and the hope of his people. She, in turn, was placing her entire future in the hands of a man her world had branded a savage. She was betting her life on the quiet integrity she had witnessed against the loud, corrupt authority of Marshal Miller. Just as the first, palest trace of pewter grey appeared on the horizon, etching the silhouettes of the eastern peaks, they were ready. Abigail led Bessie from the lean-to. The cold was a physical shock so profound it seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. The world was utterly silent, muffled by the deep blanket of snow. A sea of white unfolded under a canopy of deep indigo, where the last, brightest stars held their vigil. It was a beauty so vast and indifferent, it was terrifying. Getting Haskell onto the horse was a trial of shared will. He leaned heavily on her shoulder, his breath hissing between clenched teeth as he fought to lift his leg over the saddle. Abigail braced herself, her smaller frame straining under his weight, feeling the tremor of his pain run through him. For one agonizing second, his strength failed, and he sagged against her. "I cannot," he breathed the words frosting in the air. "You must," she whispered back, her voice fierce. "We must." Drawing on some hidden reserve of will, he pushed himself upright, settling into the saddle with a choked gasp. He sat rigid, his back straight, his face a stony mask of endurance. He was a warrior once more, his throne, a worn leather saddle, his kingdom, the unforgiving wilderness. He would not show his pain again. "The main trail will be watched." Hasker set his voice low and tight, each word costing him. He pointed with his chin towards a dense line of snow-laden pines that marched up the slope of the foothills. "We go through the trees. The brush is thick. It will hide our tracks for a time. It is a harder path, but the safe one. Abigail took Bessie's reins without a word. She would walk. Every step she took would spare the horse's strength and lessen the jarring torment for the man in the saddle. She cast one final glance at the cabin, its windows dark and empty, a tombstone for the life she had known. Then she turned her face towards the mountains and plunged into the snow, pulling Bessie and her wounded rider into the shadows of the forest. The journey had begun. The beauty of the landscape was a cruel deception. The pristine snow, which looked as soft as down, was a relentless adversary. It concealed rocks and fallen logs that twisted her ankles and fought her every step. In the open glades, the drifts were thigh-deep, forcing her to push through the heavy powder with a lung-searing effort. Bessie, a creature of pastures and gentle trails, struggled behind her, her powerful legs sinking her breath coming in great steaming clouds. The quiet of the forest was broken only by the rhythmic crunch and drag of their passage, and Abigail's own ragged gasps for air. Hasker, though locked in his own battle with pain, became their compass. His connection to this land was an instinct, a second sight. He would let out a low grunt and point, and Abigail would see what he had seen, a line of bent saplings indicating a hidden gully. The subtle sheen of black ice beneath a dusting of snow, a barely visible game trail that offered a few yards of easier passage. He was not merely a passenger. He was reading the story of the earth, guiding them through its treacherous paragraphs. They paused at midday, a brief ceasefire in their war against the wilderness. Tucked into the lee of a granite outcropping, Abigail coaxed a tiny, smokeless fire from a handful of dry pine needles and twigs. The small lick of flame was a pathetic defiance against the overwhelming cold, but its warmth on their frozen hands felt like a miracle. She melted snow in the tin cup, boiled it, and made coffee which they shared, passing the cup back and forth in a silent communion. The tracks, she said the words she had been holding back all morning. Even through the trees, we leave a trail. Miller is a tracker. He will find it. Hasker stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. He picked up a stick and scraped away a patch of snow, revealing the dark, frozen earth. Before the snow, you walked to the creek for water. Every day. He drew a wavering line representing her old path, leading away from the mountains towards the lowlands. Then he drew a second straighter line representing their current path, heading directly into the peaks. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. Miller will come. He will find the cabin empty. He will see my tracks from the porch, and yours and the horse. He will see these tracks leading to the high country. He paused, letting the fear of it settle. But he will also see your old tracks to the creek. They are faint, but they are there. He will believe the new tracks are a trick. He will think the wounded Indian is trying to fool him. He tapped the line leading away from the mountains. He will believe you panicked, a frightened woman running for the safety of the settlement. He will follow that trail first. He thinks you are a sheep. He will not believe the sheep would run into the wolf's den to save another wolf. A cold spark of understanding lit in Abigail. Hasker had not only anticipated Miller's actions, but had diagnosed the prejudice that would drive them. Miller's arrogance, his dismissal of her as a helpless female, and Hasker as a cunning but predictable savage, was the very thing that might save them. It was a brilliant, bitter piece of psychology. But he will check the pass eventually. She argued, the hope in her chest warring with a persistent dread. Yes, Hasker conceded, his gaze turning towards the towering peaks above them. He will check the pass. Last. He is certain I am dying. He thinks the mountains and the cold will kill me for him. He thinks he has all the time in the world. They pushed on the brief respite, making the return to the cold all the more jarring. The terrain grew steeper, the climb relentless. They were in the high country now, a world of rock and wind and sky. The air thinned, and every breath was a conscious effort. Abigail's body was a symphony of agony. Her thighs burned, her back ached, and the raw strap of the burlap sack had rubbed her shoulder raw. She moved in a trance of exhaustion. Her focus narrowed to the next step and the next. She powered herself with memories of Thomas's smile and with a cold, hard fury at Wade Miller. She would not let that man's world be the one that endured. As the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, they finally saw it. High above them, carved into the colossal wall of rock that formed the spine of the mountains, was a deep, sharp V. It was a wound in the stone, the only point of passage for miles. Lukachukai Haska whispered the name, a reverent exhalation. The pass. Their destination. The sight gave them a final desperate surge of adrenaline. They scrambled upward, racing the encroaching twilight. They reached the mouth of the pass just as the sun's last light vanished, plunging the world into a deep, cold blue. The wind funneled by the narrow cliffs screamed through the opening, a physical assault of sound and ice. The path ahead was a corridor of deep shadow walled by sheer rock faces that seemed to lean in, threatening to crush them. It was then that she saw them. Positioned at the narrowest point of the pass, where the trail was barely wide enough for a single horse, were 3 riders. They were as still and silent as the surrounding rock, their forms merging with the gloom. Their ponies stood patiently accustomed to the cold. They were Navajo, and they were armed. A cry, a mixture of pain relief and recognition, tore from Haska's throat. "Shire," he called out. "My son." Though the men were his brothers, it was a term of endearment and deep kinship. The only answer was the howl of the wind. The lead rider, an older man, with hair as grey as a winter sky, and a face carved with the harsh lines of suspicion, nudged his pony forward a few steps. He did not speak. He simply raised his rifle, its barrel a black, unblinking eye in the twilight. The gesture was unambiguous. Shilake Haska called again, his voice cracking with strain and confusion. "My brothers!" He slid clumsily from Bessie's back, his legs nearly buckling. He steadied himself and took a halting step forward, raising a hand, palm open, in the universal sign of peace. The lead rider finally spoke. His words were sharp, guttural, striking the rock walls and echoing back like thrown stones. Abigail could not understand the language, but the tone, cold accusatory, steeped in anger, was unmistakable. Haska answered his voice, pleading. He gestured from his bandaged side to Abigail, then to the sacred bundle at his hip. He was a storyteller, trying to convey an epic with a few desperate gestures. But his audience was not listening. Their eyes, hard and dark, with generations of mistrust, were fixed on Abigail. They saw the rifle on her saddle. They saw her white skin. They saw not a rescuer, but a captor. They saw their wounded brother, not being saved, but being delivered into a trap. The youngest of the 3, his face a mask of impulsive fury, raised his own rifle and cocked the hammer. The sharp, metallic click-clack was the loudest sound in the world, a definitive full stop to all hope. Abigail's blood turned to ice. It was a horrifying, perfect tragedy. After surviving the storm, the wound, the lawman, the wilderness, they would die here, caught in the crossfire of a misunderstanding. She saw the scene through their eyes, and her heart broke. It was the oldest story on this frontier, told in blood and lies. Haska turned to her, his face a canvas of utter despair. The warrior's mask had shattered. "They do not understand," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "They cannot see you. They see only a Bilagayana woman with a gun." He looked back at his brothers, his expression desolate. "When they look at you, they see a ghost. The ghost of all our pain." The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. The rifle in the lead rider's hands was steady, his aim true. In that heart-stopping moment, Abigail made a choice. She did not reach for her own weapon. Instead, she remembered the reverence with which Haska had treated his jish, the medicine bundle. Slowly, deliberately, she held up her empty hands, showing she meant no harm. Then, looking not at the angry brothers, but at Haska, she gave a slight, respectful bow of her head, a gesture of deference to him and his mission. Haska saw it. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He turned back to his brothers and began to speak again. His voice different now, not pleading, but commanding. He spoke of the storm of fire and water. He used the name she had given him, Atsa, eagle. He pointed not to his wound as a sign of his weakness, but to the intact medicine bundle as a sign of their shared triumph. He held up the misshapen bullet Marshal Miller had fired, and then he pointed down the trail in the direction of the white man's law. The truth spoken in his own tongue, with the quiet dignity of a warrior who had been to the edge of death and back finally pierced their armor of suspicion. The lead rider slowly, reluctantly lowered his rifle. The pass was open. The story of Abigail and Haska is a testament to the fact that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice of compassion in its very face. It's a reminder that beneath the banners of tribe and nation, beyond the boundaries of language and prejudice, beats the same human heart, capable of extraordinary bravery and profound connection. Their journey through the snow was more than an escape. It was a testament to the enduring power of empathy in a world determined to tear us apart. If their story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear a tale of hope and courage. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories from the untamed heart of the past. Click that notification bell so you never miss a journey back in time. Thank you for listening.